You know you should leave. Everyone tells you to leave. You've tried to leave a dozen times, but somehow you always go back. And the worst part, you don't even understand why. If I told you that what you're experiencing isn't love, isn't weakness, and isn't your fault, but rather a scientifically documented psychological phenomena that hijacks your brain's reward system and keeps you addicted to the very person destroying you, would you believe me? In the next few minutes, I'm going to explain the neuroscience and psychology behind trauma bonding, why it's one of the most powerful and misunderstood attachment patterns in human relationships, and most importantly, how to recognize if you're trapped in one right now. This isn't about love. It's about survival mechanisms gone wrong. Let's break the cycle. Welcome back to Psyche Path, where we decode your mind. If you're ready to understand the psychology others ignore, hit subscribe, because today gets real. Think about the last time someone told you to just leave a toxic relationship. Maybe it was your relationship, maybe it was a friend's. And the advice was simple, right? If they treat you badly, walk away. If they hurt you, leave. If you're unhappy, end it. Sounds logical? Sounds easy. But if you've ever been in a trauma bond, you know it's not that simple. Because trauma bonding isn't logical. It doesn't follow the rules of healthy attachment. It operates on a completely different psychological mechanism. One that actually gets stronger the worse the relationship becomes. And that's what makes it so dangerous and so misunderstood. Today, we go in deep into the psychology of why people stay in relationships that are clearly destroying them. Not because they're weak, not because they're stupid, but because their brain has been chemically rewired to associate pain with love, chaos with connection, and suffering with intimacy. Before we dive into the darkness, let's be clear about what trauma bonding actually is, because most people misuse this term. Trauma bonding is not simply staying in a bad relationship. It's not just having a toxic ex you miss sometimes. Trauma bonding is a specific psychological attachment that forms between an abuser and their victim through cycles of abuse, devaluation, and positive reinforcement. The term was coined by psychologist Patrick Carnase in his research on exploitative relationships, and it describes a paradoxical emotional attachment where the victim develops loyalty, even love towards someone who is intermittently abusive. The key word here is intermittent. If someone was abusive all the time, you'd leave. Your brain would recognize the constant threat and activate survival instincts. But trauma bonds form specifically because the abuse is unpredictable, mixed with moments of kindness, affection, or apology. This creates what psychologists call an intermittent reinforcement schedule, which is the most powerful form of psychological conditioning known to science. Here's where it gets fascinating from a psychological perspective. Trauma bonding isn't exclusive to romantic relationships, although that's where most people encounter it. It can happen in parent-child relationships where a child is abused but also occasionally shown love. It happens in cults where leaders alternate between punishment and praise. It happens in hostage situations, which is why the Stockholm Syndrome exists. And it happens in workplaces with abusive bosses who alternate between cruelty and recognition. The common thread: power imbalance plus intermittent reinforcement. One person has control, and they use that control to create an addictive cycle of pain and relief, punishment and reward, terror and comfort. And your brain, trying to make sense of this chaos, starts to associate the person causing your pain with the relief from that pain. They become both the disease and the cure. And that's the trap. The neuroscience behind this is actually stunning. When you're in a relationship with someone who treats you well consistently, your brain releases oxytocin and dopamine at relatively stable levels. You feel good, you feel safe, you feel connected. But when you're in a trauma bond, something different happens. During the abuse phase, your stress hormones spike. Cortisol floods your system. You're in fight or flight mode. Your brain is screaming danger. Then, when the abuser shifts and shows you kindness, affection, or apologizes, your brain doesn't just return to baseline. It floods with dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction, because the relief from pain feels more intense than simple pleasure. Going from terror to safety, from abandonment to connection, from worthlessness to being told you're special. This creates a dopamine surge that's more powerful than what you'd get from a healthy, stable relationship. And your brain starts to crave it. You become literally addicted to the cycle. Let me tell you about the cycle itself, because understanding it is crucial. Trauma bonds don't form overnight. They develop through a specific pattern that abusers, whether consciously or unconsciously, repeat. Stage 1 is idealization, also called love bombing. In the beginning, the relationship feels perfect. They're attentive, affectionate, constantly texting, making you feel like the most important person in the world. They mirror your values, your interests, your desires. This isn't normal courtship. It's an intense, overwhelming rush of attention that feels like fate. Like you found your soulmate. What's really happening? They're studying you, figuring out your vulnerabilities, your insecurities, what you need emotionally. And they're creating a baseline of happiness that they'll later use as leverage. Stage 2 is devaluation. Gradually or suddenly, the warmth disappears. They become critical, distant, or outright cruel. They pick fights over nothing. They withdraw affection. They make you feel like you're walking on eggshells, constantly trying to figure out what you did wrong. The person who made you feel special now makes you feel worthless. And here's the key: you don't understand why. You're confused. You're desperate to get back to stage 1, to that feeling of being loved and valued. So you start changing yourself, apologizing for things you didn't do, trying harder, giving more. You're doing exactly what they want. Trying to earn back the love they showed you at the beginning. But it doesn't work. Or it works temporarily, only for the cycle to repeat. Stage 3 is the discard or the threat of discard. They pull away completely, or they threaten to leave, or they actually leave for a period. This creates panic. Because by now, your entire sense of worth is tied to their approval. Losing them feels like losing yourself. Your abandonment wounds are triggered. You're willing to do anything to get them back. And when they return, or when they offer you the smallest crumb of affection after days or weeks of coldness, you feel overwhelming relief and gratitude. You're grateful that someone who's been treating you horribly is now treating you slightly less horribly. That's the trap. That's the addiction. That's the trauma bond. Stage 4, if you haven't left by now, is repetition. The cycle repeats, but each time, your tolerance for mistreatment increases. What would have been unacceptable in the beginning becomes your new normal. The periods of kindness get shorter. The periods of abuse get longer. But you stay, not because you're weak, because your brain has been conditioned, because the intermittent reinforcement has created an addiction, because you keep hoping that if you just love them hard enough, if you're patient enough, if you're perfect enough, They'll go back to being the person they were in stage 1. But here's the truth. That person never existed. That was a mask, a performance designed to hook you. The real person is the one cycling through these stages. Now let's talk about why this is so different from normal relationship problems. In a healthy relationship that's going through difficulties, both people acknowledge the issues. There's mutual respect even during conflict. Apologies lead to changed behavior. There's consistency in how you're treated. The relationship might have ups and downs, but there's a baseline of safety and respect that never disappears. In a trauma bond, there's no consistency except the cycle itself. The abuse isn't about specific conflicts that can be resolved. It's about control. It's about keeping you off balance, dependent, and questioning your reality. The apologies aren't followed by real change. They're just part of the cycle, designed to keep you hooked. And there's often gaslighting, where they deny their abusive behavior, rewrite history, and make you question your memory and perception. Over time, you stop trusting yourself. You start believing maybe you were too sensitive, too demanding, too crazy. Maybe you are the problem. Here's where it gets dark, really dark. The people most vulnerable to trauma bonding aren't weak people. They're often highly empathetic, compassionate people who had inconsistent or traumatic childhoods. If you grew up with a parent who was sometimes loving and sometimes cruel, your brain learned early that love is chaotic, that you have to work for affection, that being treated badly is normal. This creates what psychologists call an insecure attachment style, usually anxious or disorganized. When you enter adult relationships, you unconsciously seek out the familiar pattern. Not because you want to be hurt, but because your brain recognizes the chaos as love. It's what you know. It's what feels normal. And when you meet someone who treats you with consistent kindness, it might actually feel boring, suspicious, or unfamiliar. You might even sabotage it because it does unmatch your internal template of what love is supposed to feel like. Research by Dr. Donald Dutton found that people who form trauma bonds often have 4 key characteristics in common. First, a perceived threat to survival, either physical or emotional. The abuser has made them feel that their well-being, financial security, or sense of identity depends on the relationship. Second, the victim perceives small kindnesses from the abuser as acts of profound love. Because the baseline has become so negative, any moment where they're not being abused feels like genuine affection. Third, isolation from perspectives other than the abuser's. Over time, the victim's world shrinks. Friends drift away. Family gets cut off. The only reality that matters is the abuser's version of events. And fourth, perceived inability to escape, whether due to finances, children, threats, fear, or simply psychological conditioning. The victim believes they cannot leave or that leaving would be worse than staying. Let me share a real example that illustrates this perfectly. Sarah met David after a difficult divorce. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her life. Within weeks, he was professing love, talking about their future, making her feel seen in ways her ex-husband never had. 3 months in, he moved into her apartment. That's when things shifted. He started criticizing her appearance, her parenting, her career. He'd be cold for days, then suddenly affectionate, then cold again. She never knew which version of him she'd get. She found herself constantly trying to please him, walking on eggshells, changing her behavior to avoid conflict. When she tried to discuss the relationship, he'd either deny her concerns, insisting she was overreacting, or he'd have an emotional breakdown, crying about his difficult childhood, making her feel guilty for bringing it up. She stayed for 3 years, not because she wanted to, but because leaving felt impossible. He'd isolated her from friends. He'd convinced her that her anxiety was the real problem. And on the rare days when he was kind, she felt such relief and hope that she convinced herself things were getting better. It took her best friend staging an intervention and physically helping her move out for Sarah to leave. And even then, even knowing intellectually that the relationship was toxic, she struggled for months with the urge to go back. That's a trauma bond. That's the power of this psychological trap. The brain chemistry of trauma bonding is almost identical to drug addiction. Dr. Helene Fisher's research using fMRI scans showed that when people in trauma-bonded relationships looked at photos of their abuser, the same brain regions lit up as in cocaine addicts looking at cocaine. The nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, regions associated with reward, motivation, and craving. These aren't areas you can control with willpower. They're deep, primal parts of your brain that operate below conscious thought. This is why people can know intellectually that the relationship is destroying them but still can't leave. Because the addiction isn't emotional, it's neurological. The brain has been hijacked. There's also a phenomenon called cognitive dissonance at play. Your brain can't reconcile to contradictory beliefs. On one hand, you believe this person loves you. They said they love you. You have memories of good times. On the other hand, their actions are hurting you. To resolve this dissonance, your brain has to make a choice. Either they don't actually love you and you've been deceived, which means you were foolish and wasted years of your life, or they do love you and the problems are somehow your fault, which means if you change, the love will return. The second option, even though it's false, is psychologically easier to accept. So you blame yourself. You try harder. You stay. This is how trauma bonds survive, even when the abuse is obvious to everyone else. Here's the practical part. How do you know if you're in a trauma bond versus just a difficult relationship? Ask yourself these questions honestly. Do you find yourself defending or justifying their behavior to others, even when you know deep down it's wrong? Do you feel like you're constantly trying to earn their love or approval, like you're never quite good enough? Are there extreme highs and lows with no middle ground? Periods where everything is perfect, followed by periods where you're miserable? Do you feel anxious when you're away from them? Not because you miss them in a healthy way, but because you're worried about what mood they'll be in when you return? Have you lost touch with friends or family? Or do you hide the reality of your relationship from them? Do you make excuses for staying that you wouldn't accept if a friend said them to you? Do you feel trauma bonded to them despite knowing the relationship is unhealthy? If you're answering yes to most of these, you're likely in a trauma bond, not a healthy relationship with problems. Breaking a trauma bond is one of the hardest psychological challenges a person can face. It's not like ending a normal relationship where you grieve and move on. Because you're not just leaving a person, you're breaking an addiction. You're going against every signal your brain is sending you. Here's what the process actually looks like. First, you need external support. You cannot do this alone. The isolation is part of what keeps the bond intact. Reach out to a therapist who specializes in trauma and abusive relationships. Reconnect with friends or family you've distanced yourself from. Join support groups. You need people who can reflect reality back to you when your brain is lying to you. Second, you need physical distance. No contact, not low contact. No contact. Because every interaction, Even a text message reactivates the bond. It's like asking a recovering alcoholic to just have one sip. It doesn't work. The brain's reward pathways reactivate, and you're pulled back in. Third, expect withdrawal. Literally, you will experience symptoms similar to drug withdrawal. Anxiety, depression, obsessive thoughts about the person, physical cravings to see them, intense emotional pain. This is your brain screaming for its dopamine fix. It will lie to you. It will tell you that going back will make the pain stop. It will rewrite history, making you remember only the good times. This is where you need your support system to remind you of reality. Fourth, grieve what you thought the relationship was, not what it actually was. Mourn the potential, the fantasy, the person you hoped they'd become. Because that's what you're really attached to, the illusion. And finally, do the deeper work. Understand your attachment patterns. Heal the childhood wounds that made you vulnerable to this dynamic in the first place. Because without that work, you risk repeating the pattern with someone else. Here's something important that doesn't get talked about enough. If you're the person in the relationship exhibiting the abusive behaviors that create trauma bonds, if you recognize yourself as the one cycling through idealization, devaluation, and control, that's crucial self-awareness. Trauma bonding behavior often comes from unresolved trauma. Maybe you saw this pattern modeled by your parents. Maybe you have an undiagnosed personality disorder like borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. Maybe you've never learned healthy relationship skills. Recognizing the pattern is the first step. The next step is professional help, not couples therapy that often makes things worse in abusive dynamics. Individual therapy focused on attachment, emotional regulation, and accountability. Change is possible, but it requires genuine willingness to face your own behaviors and their impact on others. Let me be very clear about what trauma bonding is not. It's not loving someone who has flaws. It's not staying through hard times. It's not working through conflict. Healthy relationships have ups and downs. People make mistakes, but there's a fundamental difference. In healthy relationships, both people are committed to growth, to treating each other with respect, to taking accountability for harm caused. In trauma bonds, there's a power imbalance, a pattern of control, and a cycle that repeats without genuine change. If you're reading this and thinking, but they're not always bad, they have good qualities too, that's exactly the point. If they were bad all the time, you wouldn't be bonded. The intermittent kindness is what keeps the bond alive. That's the mechanism. That's the trap. So here's your challenge. If you suspect you're in a trauma bond, tell one person you trust, not to ask their permission to stay or leave, but to start breaking the isolation. Say it out loud. Describe the cycle without justifying it. And then listen to how they respond. Because people outside the bond can see what you can't. They're not chemically attached. They're not in the fog. And their perspective might be the lifeline you need. And if you're watching this and thinking about someone you know who's trapped in this cycle, be patient. Don't judge. Don't demand they leave. Understand that what they're experiencing is a psychological addiction, not a choice. Offer support without ultimatums. Be the consistent, safe presence that reminds them what healthy relationships look like. And when they're ready, help them escape. Now, if this video helped you understand what you've been experiencing, if it gave you language for something you couldn't explain before, the next video you need to watch breaks down the psychology of narcissistic abuse and how it differs from other toxic dynamics. Hit subscribe because we're building a complete guide to understanding the darkest patterns in human relationships. And remember, leaving isn't weakness. Staying isn't strength. Understanding what's happening to your brain, that's power. Break the bond. Reclaim yourself.